The year was 1878. The month was November. The air in the high plains of Wyoming had the sharp, clean edge of a new knife. And stood on the frozen dirt porch, her hands knotted together at her waist. She wore a wool shawl, threadbare at the elbows, over a faded calico dress. It was not nearly enough for the cold that was coming. The wind knew it. The sky knew it. The mountains watched, silent and indifferent, their peaks already white with the season's first promise. Her mother, Helen, stood beside her, a woman of 70 years made smaller by grief and the chill. Beside them, watchful and low, was Kaiser, their dog, his breath pluming in the thin air. Her brother-in-law, John, stood in the doorway of the house that had been her home for 6 months. He held the door half-closed, a barrier of worn pine. He was not a cruel man, not by nature. He was a tired man, a man whose ledger of charity had run out of ink. His own harvest had been poor, his children were thin, and the 2 extra mouths had become an impossible weight. "I cannot keep you," he said. The words were flat, stripped of apology. "The town has no place. The church has no room. This is all I can offer." He tossed a single, heavy iron key onto the porch steps. It landed with a dull clank that seemed to echo in the vast quiet. "The old line shack up on Grayback Mountain. It's my property, so no one can run you off. But it's empty." That was the cruelest version of the truth. It was not empty. It was less than empty. It was forgotten. It was a ruin. And looked at the key, resting in the dust. It was rusted, ornate, a key to a place nobody wanted. This key, and what she would unlock with it, would become a quiet legend in these parts. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and we'll begin. And had always been a reader. Not of novels or psalms, but of almanacs, engineering pamphlets, and survey maps her late husband, a railroad surveyor, had left behind. While other women in the small settlement of Providence traded recipes for apple brown Betty, and was reading about soil composition and water tables. She did not speak of it. She simply observed. She noticed how the frost held longer on the north side of John's barn. She saw how the runoff from the spring thaw pooled in the west pasture, souring the ground. Her husband, Thomas, had understood this quality in her. He had loved her quiet, meticulous mind. When he brought home a book on French intensive gardening, she had read it not as a curiosity, but as a manual. In the small patch of earth behind their own cabin, she had coaxed lettuce to grow into the first frost and radishes to sprout in soil others deemed barren. But Thomas was gone now, taken by a fever that had swept through a railroad camp the previous year. And in Providence, a woman's worth was measured by the strength of her husband or the number of her sons. A widow with an aging mother was a burden. A widow who read about geology was a curiosity bordering on a witch. When she and her mother had moved in with John, she had tried to apply her knowledge. She suggested rotating his meager corn crop with beans to replenish the soil. She pointed out that building a simple stone channel could divert the spring runoff and save the west pasture. John, a man who farmed the way his father had farmed, saw this not as help, but as a quiet accusation. His pride, already raw from a poor yield, could not bear it. The community saw it the same way. The minister, Mr. Abernathy, had a way of looking at her over the top of his spectacles during sermons about a woman's proper place. One Sunday, speaking to a parishioner just loudly enough for Anne to hear, he'd said, "It is an unnatural mind that seeks to command the earth. The Lord provides the seasons. Our place is to accept them, not to rearrange them to our liking." That was what they believed. That her attention to detail, her desire to understand how things worked, was a form of arrogance. An unnatural mind. They did not see a woman trying to make things better. They saw a woman who did not know her place. The world of Providence had no category for her. She was not a wife, not a mother in their eyes, just a quiet, observant presence who made them uncomfortable. The final rejection was systemic, not personal, though it felt deeply personal. The failed harvest wasn't her fault, but it was convenient to believe it was. Her experiments in John's garden, a few rows of winter greens she'd managed to protect with cold frames made of old glass, were seen as proof of her meddling. She was a drain on scarce resources, a presence that coincided with bad luck. It was easier to cast her out than to question the way things had always been done. So they were cast out. John's final act was giving them the key to the line shack. It was a gesture that allowed him to believe he had not thrown them into the wilderness to die. He had given them shelter. He had fulfilled the letter of his obligation, if not the spirit. And picked up the key. She did not argue. She did not plead. She met her brother-in-law's gaze, held it for a moment, and then turned away. She helped her mother down the steps, called for the dog, and began the long walk toward Greyback Mountain, the iron key cold and heavy in her pocket. She was walking toward a ruin. But in her mind, she was walking away from one. The walk was 5 miles, all of it uphill. Each step was a negotiation with the thinning air and the growing cold. Her mother, Helen, leaned on her, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Kaiser, the dog, ranged ahead and then circled back, his presence a silent, steady question. Are we there yet? Is this the place? They found the shack just as the sun began to drop behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. It was worse than she had imagined. The roof had collapsed on one side. The wind blew straight through the gaps between the warped plank walls. A single rusted stovepipe lay on the ground, a hollow bone picked clean by seasons of neglect. This was not shelter. This was a collection of firewood that hadn't been cut yet. The cold at night was not a feeling. It was a presence. It seeped through their thin blankets, through their clothes, and settled deep in their bones. And lay awake, her mother shivering beside her, the dog curled into a tight ball at their feet. The temperature dropped. 11 below zero, the almanac would have called it. And just called it the end. The shivering was the worst part. It was an involuntary violence, a tremor that started in her jaw and worked its way down her spine until her whole body was a shuddering engine, burning calories she did not have. Her teeth ached. Her fingers went from burning to numb, a strange and terrifying absence at the ends of her arms. For 3 days, they lived in the lee of the ruined shack, sheltered only by a single, partially intact wall. And spent the daylight hours gathering wood, her movement slow and clumsy, her mind fogged with cold. She made a fire, but it was a desperate, hungry thing that consumed wood almost as fast as she could gather it. It offered the illusion of warmth, but not the reality of it. The wind stole every bit of heat. On the 4th morning, her mother could not get up. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. She was not shivering anymore. That was what scared her the most. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. Stillness meant it was starting to lose. And sat by the meager fire, feeding it stick by stick. She thought about going back. She imagined knocking on John's door. She imagined the shame. She imagined the cold oatmeal and the colder glances. She thought about the warmth of his kitchen, a warmth she had taken for granted. For a moment, it seemed like the only sane thing to do. To go back and beg. To trade her pride for her mother's life. She lay down in the thin blanket, the snow beginning to fall in fat, silent flakes. She closed her eyes. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps this was where their story ended, a footnote in the history of a harsh winter, 2 women and a dog who simply disappeared into the white. But something pulled her back. It was not a miracle. It was a sentence from one of her husband's geology pamphlets, read months ago in the warmth of a different life. Limestone formations in this region are often characterized by extensive cave systems, their passages carved by millennia of water action. These subterranean spaces maintain a constant, year-round temperature, typically averaging between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, moderated by the Earth itself. The Earth itself. The thought was a spark in the cold fog of her mind. She sat up. The body moved before the mind had fully caught up. She looked at the face of Greyback Mountain, not as a solid wall of rock, but as a structure. A thing with an interior. She had spent the last 3 days looking for shelter on the mountain. She needed to be looking for shelter in it. She left her mother wrapped in every blanket they owned, the dog standing guard, and began to climb. She followed the lines of the rock, looking for the telltale signs described in the pamphlet: outcroppings of weathered limestone, darker patches of vegetation suggesting moisture seeping from within, fissures in the stone. For hours, she found nothing but sheer rock faces and shallow overhangs. The dizziness came first, a lightheadedness from hunger and exertion. She had to stop, bracing herself against the rock, her vision swimming. She crawled to a patch of snow and ate it by the handful, the colder shock that cleared her head for a few moments. It was Kaiser who found it. He had darted ahead, disappearing behind a thick curtain of ancient, gnarled junipers that clung to the mountainside. He let out a single, low bark. Not a bark of alarm, but of discovery. And scrambled after him, pulling aside the heavy, snow-dusted branches. Behind them was a dark opening in the rock, no bigger than a cabin door. A breath of air, distinctly warmer and smelling of damp earth and stone, flowed out to meet her. It was not warm. But it was not freezing. She lit a precious match, cupping it against the wind, and peered inside. The flame illuminated a passage that sloped gently downward, its walls smooth and dry. She did not feel relief. Relief was too small a word. She dropped to her knees in the snow, the match burning down to her numb fingers. She felt a sense of profound, quiet recognition. This was the place. The land, which had been so indifferent, so hostile, had offered a gift. It had provided what people had refused to. She sat on the cold ground and felt something she had no word for, except right. The earth had a place for her. The first task was moving her mother. It was a slow, agonizing process. And half carried, half dragged her up the slope, stopping every few feet to rest. Helen was a dead weight, her consciousness flickering. Kaiser seemed to understand, pushing at Helen's back with his head, nudging her forward. When they finally reached the entrance and moved inside, out of the wind, the change was immediate. The terrible, pressing weight of the cold lifted. It was still chilly, a deep cellar cold, but it was a survivable cold. It was a temperature the body could fight. For the first week, the cave was just a hole in the rock. They slept on a bed of pine boughs and hauled inside, huddled together for warmth. But Anne's mind, now free from the immediate crisis of freezing, began to work. She was not just surviving. She was building. Her tools were what she could find. A flat, sharp-edged piece of shale became a knife and a scraper. She lashed it to a sturdy branch with strips of her own petticoat, creating a crude but effective hatchet. The ruins of the line shack became her quarry. She spent days dismantling it, salvaging every nail, every plank that wasn't rotten through. She hauled the pieces up the mountain, her muscles screaming in protest. The most critical project was fire. A fire inside the cave would provide heat, but the smoke could kill them. She remembered the geology pamphlet again, the part about fissures and vents. She spent 2 days exploring the cave's interior. It was not a single chamber, but a series of them, connected by narrow passages. In the second, largest chamber, she found it, a natural fissure in the ceiling, a thin crack that ran all the way up through the rock. She held a lit branch near it and watched the smoke pull straight up, sucked out by a faint, steady draft. This was her chimney. Building the fireplace was the work of a month. She used her shale axe to break up larger rocks, her hands raw and bleeding. She found a deep deposit of clay by a small, spring-fed stream that trickled through the lowest part of the cave system. She mixed the clay with dried grass and pine needles, creating a primitive but strong mortar. She laid the stones one by one, building a hearth and a firebox directly beneath the fissure. She used the salvaged stovepipe from the shack to create a rudimentary damper, a flat piece of metal she could slide over the opening to control the draft. It was ugly, lopsided work. But when she finally lit the first fire, and the smoke drew perfectly up the chimney, filling the chamber with warmth and flickering light instead of choking fumes, she sat on the stone floor and wept. With a source of heat, everything changed. She built a raised platform for her mother's bed, getting her off the cold stone floor. She used salvaged planks for the frame and wove a mattress from cattail reeds collected from a frozen marsh in the valley. She filled it with dry leaves and pine needles for insulation. The first night her mother slept through without a single coughing fit, bundled in their blankets by the gentle heat of the fire, felt like a victory greater than any harvest. That was the first proof. Not a crop, but a quiet, steady breath in the darkness. Her days fell into a rhythm. Forage. Build. Haul wood. The cave demanded fuel. She became an expert on firewood. Pine for quick, hot fires. Oak and aspen for coals that would last through the night. She stacked the wood along the dry interior walls of the cave, a fortress of fuel that grew with each passing week. The sheer quantity of it was a testament to her labor, a physical manifestation of their security. Food was a constant, gnawing concern. She set snares for rabbits and squirrels, using tricks learned from an old trapper's guide. Kaiser, with his keen nose, was an invaluable partner, cornering game for her. She learned the edible roots that could be dug from the frozen ground, wild carrot, cattail tubers. She found a grove of rose hips, shriveled and frozen on their branches, but full of precious vitamin C. She brewed them into a tart, medicinal tea for her mother. An ally arrived not as a person, but as a discovery. Deeper in the cave system, she found a chamber where the limestone walls wept with condensation. The air was humid and held the same steady, cool temperature. Here, she realized, she could store things. She carefully stored her remaining store of potatoes and onions from John's farm, wrapping each one in dry moss. They did not freeze. They did not rot. It was a natural root cellar, a gift of the mountain's geology. She realized she could grow things here, too. She had brought a small cloth sack with her, containing the seeds from her experimental garden. Using salvaged buckets and clay pots of her own making, she filled them with soil from a protected patch of earth outside the cave. Under the constant, dim light of a tallow lamp, she planted a few lettuce and radish seeds. It was a desperate, hopeful act. Weeks later, in the dead of January, a pale green shoot pushed through the dark soil. It felt more miraculous than the fire, more impossible than the shelter. It was life in a place of stone and darkness. The first head of pale, tender lettuce she harvested was an emblem of everything she had accomplished. She fed the first crisp leaf to her mother. It was proof. Not just of survival, but of creation. They had not just endured the world that rejected them. They had built a new one, underground. The community's skepticism was a distant noise. A lone trapper, caught in an early storm, had stumbled upon her path and followed it to the cave. He stayed one night, his eyes wide with disbelief at the warm, dry space, the stacks of firewood, the quiet industry of it all. He left at dawn with a full belly and a story to tell. Back in Providence, the story was met with scorn. Living in a hole like a badger, the storekeeper scoffed. She and the old woman will be dead by Thor's Mr. Abernathy warned his flock about the pride that leads one to abandon the community of man for the company of rocks and beasts. But the trapper's story planted a seed of its own. He had described the smell of wood smoke, the sight of dried herbs hanging from the stone ceiling, the quiet confidence in Anne's eyes. He had tasted her rabbit stew. Hunger and cold are more persuasive than sermons. The community did not believe, not yet. But they had heard. And they would remember. February arrived with a fury. The sky turned a bruised, slate gray and the wind began to howl, a low moan that grew into a shriek. The snow began not as flakes, but as a solid, blinding wall of white. It was a blizzard of a kind the old-timers would later speak of with a kind of reverence. The great white silence of '79. For 4 days it did not stop. The world disappeared. Roads became invisible. Houses became white mounds. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. In Providence, the carefully stacked cords of firewood began to dwindle. Food became scarce. The wind found every crack in every cabin wall. The cold was no longer an adversary. It was an occupying army. On the 5th day of the storm, a small group of men set out from the town. They were led by John. His face was gaunt, his beard crusted with ice. The certainty had gone out of him. He looked like a man who had been worn down to the bone by fear. They were not looking for an out of concern. They were looking for her out of desperation. The trapper's story, once a piece of gossip, was now their only hope. He had spoken of a mountain of firewood and a shelter the wind could not touch. It took them 6 hours to travel 2 miles, wading through drifts that were shoulder deep. When they finally found the juniper curtain, they were half frozen, their hope worn to a thread. John pulled back the branches and saw the impossible, a faint, warm light spilling from the mouth of the cave. He smelled wood smoke. Anne was by the fire, mending one of her mother's socks, when Kaiser let out a low growl. She looked up to see the men standing at the entrance, their forms dark against the swirling white outside. They looked like ghosts. John stood at the front, his hat in his hands, snow melting in his beard. He looked smaller than she remembered. He did not apologize. He did not have the words for it. He simply said, "We need help. The town, we're freezing. We're running out of wood." And looked at the exhausted, desperate faces. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. The part of her that might have wanted to see him humbled had frozen to death on his porch months ago. All that was left was a quiet, practical competence. She stood up. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How many people are in your party?" she asked. "5 of us," John stammered. "There is room by the fire. Bring them in." "How far is the road passable?" They huddled by her fire, sipping the hot, bitter tea she made from rose hips. They stared at the stacks of firewood lining the walls, at the strings of dried meat, at the pale green lettuce growing in its bucket. They were looking at a miracle built of shale and clay and stubbornness. John's gaze fell on Anne's mother, asleep on her raised bed, a thick wool blanket tucked around her. She was warm. She was safe. The sight seemed to break something in him. He looked at Anne, his eyes full of a shame he could not speak. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "I was wrong." He looked at the perfectly stacked cords of firewood, each piece cut to the same length. "You always did see things different," he said. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology. It was enough. Before he and his men left, taking with them as much firewood as they could carry, he took the heavy, well-made axe from his own belt and laid it on the stone hearth. It was his father's axe, his most prized tool. It was a silent admission. A transfer of title. This place was hers. And did not require an apology. Her actions had made apologies irrelevant. As she watched them go, she said the only thing that needed to be said. "The handle on that axe is hickory. It will not crack in the cold." She never moved back to Providence. But she was no longer an outcast. The cave became a known place, a way station for travelers caught in storms, a source of knowledge for those willing to ask. She fed 40 people from the town of Providence during that blizzard, sending them back with food and wood until the storm broke. She taught 3 other families how to build cold frames, how to find dry caves, how to read the land not as an enemy, but as a difficult partner. Her mother lived for 5 more years, passing away peacefully in her sleep one spring morning. And buried her in a small clearing near the cave, marking the spot with a simple fieldstone. And herself lived to be 78. She died on a mild autumn afternoon, sitting in a sturdy chair she had built herself near the mouth of the cave. A catalogue of seeds from a company back east was open in her lap. Kaiser's great-grandson was asleep at her feet. She looked like a person who had just finished a long and satisfying book. Her epitaph, carved by a man whose family she had saved that winter, was a single sentence on a simple wooden marker: "She built a home here." They say the world has no category for people like that. The ones who see things different. The ones who read the land instead of just living on it. The ones who are dismissed or cast out because their vision makes others uncomfortable. But perhaps you have a place like that. A sealed door. A dismissed gift. A cave you have been standing outside of, holding the key, believing the world when it told you it was just an empty ruin. You have been told your difference is a liability. You have been told your quiet observations are unnatural. And you have been waiting for permission to turn the key and see what is actually inside. That rusted iron key was not the key to a ruin. It was the key to a kingdom built of stone and silence. The only difference between a burden and a foundation is what you are willing to build upon it. If these stories of quiet resilience are what you seek, consider subscribing to our channel for more journeys into the past.